Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this day, for this new morning, and for this study that we are beginning as of yesterday to go through and understand the reform lines. We know some of this can be quite basic, but we know that there's much that we do not understand, and we need your Holy Spirit to speak to us, to guide and direct us, to correct old errors. And we know, Lord, that the foundation had been laid solid. It's a solid foundation. And we ask that with your Spirit that we can build upon it to complete the structure. Thank you for hearing our prayer. May your Holy Spirit teach and guide us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good morning, everyone. Now,
Morning.
Yep, good morning. So we have the path laid out before us in that we know this line upon line, as we saw yesterday from Isaiah 28, is addressing the Sunday law. That is, it is the counsel in Isaiah 28 is to us who are approaching that Sunday law, and it's telling us how to study. And we have been studying according to the rules of William Miller. God has given us instruction, and we have been following it. But we know that from December 25th, the call to repentance, which has been happening since July 18th, to separate from the strange wives, means that some of us, maybe all of us, are to some degree influenced by ideas that need to be changed. And it's not an easy thing. Now, back in 2017, while I was at the School of the Prophets, and Stephen Jameson was there as well as Heidi and myself. So we had come to understand the waymark of midnight. Now, in the reform lines, 2016. Yeah.
You said 17.
Did I say 2017?
Yes, carry on, please.
Okay. Thought I said 20. Well, it's recorded. We can tell what I said.
You did say 2017.
Okay, weird. Okay, 2016. My brain was saying 2016. My lips weren't. So what Jeff had suggested is that we need to go back and look at these lines because we have this new waymark. Now, in a sense, the midnight cry was there because we hadn't really defined what that revival was. And so, but to go back and look at the lines, well, we were moving forward. It was really hard for the movement to sort of go back and try to understand what was happening with the lines. For one, in 2016, we were talking about Trump, that he's going to be elected possibly, that he would be typified by Xerxes. We had the light that was coming from chronology. We were trying to deal with the binding off. It was a binding off camp meeting that we had in the fall, and it was a binding off School of the Prophets that we had in the summer. Though I don't think we ever learned anything about the binding off. I mean, it was sort of one of these things so many other things were happening. We were memorizing some statements from the Spirit of Prophecy about the binding off. And that's, again, another one of those other unfinished structures. You know, what does the binding off really mean? And if you ask people in this movement, we probably wouldn't really understand what Jeff was getting at and what that meant. So the one thing, though, that we didn't do, that Jeff wanted to do, that he said we need to do someday, is to go back over these reform lines and understand them in the context of all the light that we have received since the reform lines were first given to us. Now, one of the things which which I tried to bring out in my paper after July 18th, was a number of things. I mean, and we spent some time studying it this last weekend. The idea is that the parable of the 10 virgins is what is repeated to the very letter, not necessarily Millerite history. Now, of course, the two are the same in some ways, but the parable of the 10 virgins brings out certain aspects. And we also have Samuel Snow's letters, which was something that obviously in 2016 we did not have because they came to us in 2017. And Samuel Snow's letters are a reform line within the reform line. And this is not something that we really had understood in any of the reform lines. And when we go back and we look at these reform lines, one of the things that we're going to have to understand is, what is the pattern of the reform lines actually? Is there something about the details of Millerite history that can help us to look back at other histories? And looking back at those other histories, if we can understand them better, maybe we can understand our present history. Now, people have been writing me, and I've seen things on WhatsApp where we're trying to sort out what's happening with the lines. And that is, people will ask me questions about a waymark that's coming up, and I'll always ask them what line. And they might say, well, our line. Well, what do you mean by our line? Because we have many different lines, as we know. Some of them we don't fully understand. The one question we have is midnight still future? And yet we will say that January 6th is Raphia, which would technically be midnight. And how do we understand that, right? So there are all these different types of problems. And it would be because we haven't sorted through these lines. Now, when it comes to the line that is the pattern, what is our primary reference for the structure of a reform line? Which reform line is the template?
The pattern of Christ.
Okay. Anyone else?
Starting with 1989.
Okay, so that would be the template.
The
Oh,
69 weeks or the 2300 days.
Okay. Wouldn't we say that Millerite history is the template? It gives us the template with which we
Yes.
compare all other reform lines.
Yes.
yes.
Because, and the reason would be, is that that's what Ellen White points us to.
Yes.
We know that Millerite history is going to be repeated. And that's where Jeff began. When he, in 1989, when they began this study of the chain of truth, of this reform line, of the great reformatory movements, that they all have the same pattern, he came to understand that Millerite history was going to be repeated, and that we needed to understand Millerite history to understand where we are. And that's why he would compare Millerite history with our history. He'd start with 1798. He'd have the Sunday law and the close of probation initially, because he didn't have 9/11. And then he, or what would he do? So that would be 1989, pardon me, the Sunday law and the close of probation. That would be our reform line. And then he would look at that and compare it with Millerite history. And he would say, you have 1798, and then you would have the close of probation. And no, actually what he would do, I'm trying to think now. He would put the second coming at the end. Let me see. Does anybody remember specifically what his first reform line? I'm just going to have to look it up because I can't remember how he drew the two lines. So Now you can see here what you have is the great reformatory movements. And in these great reformatory movements, we have, this is later, but even then this isn't complete. So this, I think, would be around 2015. I'm trying to remember when this chart is from, because he has lots of different charts. And so he had this, I'm just looking at all these different reform lines. Wow. Okay, so what was his original 1993 paper called? Does anybody remember the title? Was it just called Reform Lines? I think that's what it was. No. Okay, I'm going to go look here. This is, I don't know when this one is from, but when we look back at some of their old drawings, this one wouldn't be that old. I don't know who drew this one. Because this one does mention April 19th, 1844. So it's not an early one, because they would have had March 21st, 1844 as the arrival of the second angel. And I know I need to make this a bit bigger for people, I think. Well, let's just take a look at this one. So this one isn't a really early one. This we know this is probably 2014 at least. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to sort this out. So 260 years. I don't know what MOI stands for. Darkness. You have the time of the end, 1798. You have 1833. That's when Miller got his credentials. And it must be the falling of the stars there. That is those stars that are there. And then you're going to have the first angel's message empowered, and the mighty angel of Revelation 18 comes down with the little book open. The year date principle is proved. And then you'll see Protestants are mentioned. And then there's a disappointment in tearing time. Mystery of iniquity. That's what that is. Okay. And then you have the second angel arrives on April 19th. So that means this is after we understood April 19th. So this might be 2014 or 2015 this chart was made. And then you have the midnight cry, which is the second angel empowered. So you can see there's no midnight here yet. So it's not 2016 when this chart was made. And then you'll see the shut door. Now they have this writing in parchment. I'm not sure what that's a reference to specifically. And so we have the 43 chart there. Notice it has 1842, the 43 chart. It has the shut door, the number 7. And so the number 7, how is that related to the third angel's arriving? Why is there number 7 there? Is that a reference to the Sabbath?
Possibly.
Yeah, that would be the rest. So the Sabbath truth is going to come to light after the shut door. And then you're going to see this repeat of history. Now, what they do with this repeat of history is, and in this drawing, and you're going to see different versions of these lines. So that's part of the problem, is we hadn't really decided how these lines work, even though it seems like we did because we made charts. But different people had different opinions, different views. Now you can see here you got this third angel is empowered at the second waymark. So this is when the fourth angel, angel of Revelation 18, arrives, and then you're going to see, well, obviously there has to be a first in order to have the second. So that means there was a proclamation of the message prior to that. And then you're going to see the third angel arriving again, because you're going to have this three-step testing prophetic message, this reform line. Then it's not quite well defined exactly what these are, other than they say that the third angel is going to be the close of probation. But I don't know if the third angel arriving being the close of probation for the world, in this context, maybe it makes sense. So what you're going to see is you're going to see these dotted lines, and you're going to see that once again you have this time of the end formalization, and then they're going to put 9/11 there. So they're going to take this history and lay it over top. This is kind of an odd chart. It's not normally how we would see it. And so it says that 9/11 lines up with the first angels empowered, and that the Sunday law, so you can see here the Sunday law lines up with the second angel arriving. So I'm not sure when this chart is made. I mean, we know it has to be at least 2014. To me, it must be 2014, because 2015, we would have had, by then, we would have had combined the two messages. And I'm not sure who made this chart either.
Did you try checking the details?
Um,
It looks like a PDF, isn't it?
yeah, it's a PDF, and that doesn't always tell you anything.
Right.
In that sometimes,
Isn't that from FFA?
yeah,
Things
No,
are
I don't-
copied and then placed in
Yeah.
again.
yeah, people redo these copies. So this says 2016, August 2016. It was created, but it could have been created from,
Before.
yeah,
it
before
could have
that.
been
Yeah.
revised.
I mean, sometimes it's good looking at the prop, because if it said 2014, well, then we would know, okay, it was obviously created back then.
Did it have a creator?
So
Those are kinds of details that I check all.
it just says, well, it was made in Publisher originally, I think, because it's reformlines.pub. So I don't think it was originally a PDF. And it was, author says US. So
Uriah Smith?
No.
I know.
United States.
Yeah, that's what I kind of thought. But
Yeah. Now, so the reform line document, and I know I have it. I'm going to try to find this here. So Jeff's 1993 document, what's it called? Prophetic Timelines. That was the title.
I think that sounds familiar.
Prophetic Timelines. So let me search for that. I'm just going to look at the timelines.
I do have a paper called Prophetic Timelines.
You do?
Yes.
For some reason, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's called Prophetic, either Prophetic Timelines or Prophetic Lines.
It kind of looks like.
Yep, here it is. It's called Prophetic Timelines. Okay, so here it is. There it is. So this Prophetic Timelines, and it had a cover and a back cover and everything. Yeah, so this is one we had looked through. It's very, very basic, where he talks about the lines themselves. And we have gone through this when we first started looking at examining the foundation. So it's nice because it's just the idea of this prophetic timeline and how it looks, the period of darkness, the first message, the second message, the third message. And let me see here. So I just want to see where the lines are. So this would be his earliest lines. And he's going to go through a lot of these different lines too that we're going to look at. So, I mean, we're kind of reviewing what we did before, but what we're wanting to do is reconstruct these lines with what we know. Back then, we were just kind of seeing. So he has Christ's line here. So you can see the basic ideas. There's this period of darkness. There's a reform message. There's a revival message. And then he's going to have a judgment message. And then this disappointment. And then a work of restoration with the fourth message. And this becomes the basic pattern that he ended up using. And just going back, looking at this pattern, of course, you can see there is no midnight cry, and because that's not until 2014 and then 2016 where we get midnight. And this idea of this work of restoration shows up variously in the lines, and I think is misapplied in many places, especially after 1844. That is, we fail to see the connection of the four generations that precede each reform line. And that this fourth, what you have is you have a reform line, and then you have a work of restoration, which would be true, but there becomes a failure in the first generation that's not really shown here. So after a reform line, you always have the backsliding, where, you know, here he has the work of restoration, but it's in connection with a backsliding that occurs. So does he have the, okay. So he's going to show the fourth message. And that's really where one of the things is he leaves out a detail. So you're going to see this again in the line of Christ. You have the three messages, the cross, this disappointment, and then you have this fourth that occurs. And trying to understand what this is. The problem with the line of Christ is there's other reform lines mixed in, and we have to figure out how we would put Samuel Snow's letters in here. How would we put midnight and the midnight cry? And here we have the destruction of Jerusalem and then the Isle of Patmos. So this is looking at this bigger, broader line, because obviously he's paralleling here the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD with the seven last plagues, and the Isle of Patmos when John receives the vision there, that's a type of the second coming. And the question is, should these all be put on this reform line like this, or should we understand some of these as parts of other reform lines? And where do the four reform lines overlap? You know, where's Samuel Snow in this line? You know, those types of questions need to be answered. So in the original simplicity, we can see that, and we understood that God gave us this model. But as we begin to experience these lines, then we end up with a much deeper understanding of the lines. And that's why we're having to go back. So for instance, if you look at the line of Moses here, you're going to see that there is a period of darkness. He doesn't deal with how that darkness comes about or the nature of the darkness, just that there is a darkness. And we would say that the reform line that occurs is in response to that darkness. And then there's going to be a revival under the second angel's message, and then a period of judgment. And then there's going to be a disappointment and then a backsliding, right? And then there's going to be another reform. And then here he has Pentecost, and then a judgment that happens. And really the question is this correct in all of its details, or is there something that we need to see about the line of Moses that we haven't understood? So in He's got the line of Gideon. I remember all this going through this, but it's not complete. So when you look in these reform lines in 1993, it doesn't give us just the simple lining up of 1989 and 1798. So that's part of the problem that we would have with those reform lines. So trying to figure out how to approach this, how are we going to reconstruct these lines? How are we going to, I think what we would have to do is look at each of these histories. So we got here on this, it shows Noah, Moses, Elijah, Nehemiah, Jesus, and Miller. Now, in this one, which they call Nehemiah, it's actually the reform line of the 3 decrees. So if you look at this line here, they call it Nehemiah's reform line, but it starts with Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes. Now, what would be some of the problems here? So I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but when we look at the reform line of the 3 decrees, there's some really compelling things about this part of this reform line, where you have the foundations being laid. And in Cyrus's decree, that's a very literal thing, right? So we talk about in Millerite history, we have the laying of the foundations, but in Cyrus, it's the laying of the foundations of the temple. And then you can clearly see the work of the enemies that's going to happen, especially under false Smyrtus. But then you have Darius's decree, and you of course have the prophesying of Zechariah and Haggai. And here it talks about the reform of Zechariah. I'm not sure what they mean by that, if they're just talking about the rebuilding of the temple that happens under the proclamation of Haggai and Zechariah's prophesying. And then they have Artaxerxes as the 3rd decree. But there's some problems here, because the one thing I think that was a real problem in the movement was the understanding of the end of the Babylonian captivity, and also the histories of Artaxerxes and Nehemiah and how they relate. Now, we have the 7 here is being the 7-week prophecy, and we also have the walls finished. Now, are the walls finished under Artaxerxes' decree? I don't know if you can see that well, but it has Artaxerxes' 3rd decree, national sovereignty.
It does look like it.
Yeah, it looks like he put the walls finished there. But we know the walls were finished under Nehemiah's decree. And so there's things that we, because we've looked at Artaxerxes' decree, and the other thing is there a reform line in Artaxerxes' history? Just on its own? That is, remember, when you zoom into each of the waymarks in a line, isn't there a reform line within each of the waymarks? Because is there a reform line that occurs under Cyrus that we could look at that's a 3-step testing prophetic message? And how do we define that? How have we defined that reform line? Anybody know? What does arrival, formalization, and empowerment, how do we understand that within a reform line, within a waymark in a reform line? Does each waymark have an arrival, of formalization, and an empowerment?
Mhm.
Heidi says,
Yes, but do we
Says so.
start with darkness also?
Okay, so a good question, right? So how much detail, when we zoom into a waymark, the idea is that each waymark has the same characteristics as other waymarks. That is, within them, they have they contain these characteristics. And this idea, which they call fractals, when you zoom into a fractal, you see the bigger picture in this smaller picture. And the question is, how do we then sort those out? How do we decide when we're looking at a characteristics of, let's say, Cyrus's history? How do we discern which parts are part of the reform line of Cyrus himself, of that history, and how they're connected to the bigger reform line? And this has been a major problem because people don't know what reform line we're referring to when we talk about an event. What part of what reform line? Is it something that's just a detail within a reform line itself? Or is it a detail within that waymark, within that reform line? Now, here is another example. We know that we have Samuel Snow, and Samuel Snow is a development of the second angel's message, and he gives the second angel's message. That is, he begins this development earlier, and then he's going to proclaim this message later, and he spans part of the first decree. If we would be looking at it, he would be in this history of Darius's decree. And the question is, where do we place Samuel Snow? Well, if Darius's decree is the arrival of the second angel's message, which I don't think it is, but they just kind of put it all together in this history, could we see that when we zoom into Darius's decree or into the second decree, there is this development, there is an arrival of a message, a formalization of a message, and then an empowerment of a message, even under the building of the temple itself. So here in these reform lines, we don't see these details placed within each waymark. And the question is, when we zoom out and we look at them, are we going to mistakenly take some of these details and think that they're part of the bigger reform line when really they're just a zooming into one of the waymarks? Is that making sense to people? Because I don't think I'm expressing myself very well. I mean, I'm trying
I
to
understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there's marks surrounding the waymark.
Yeah. Now, we also have in this history, and we studied it in detail. We did a whole study on the book of Esther. And the question is, well, if Esther is representing the Sunday law, why does it occur before Artaxerxes' decree? And you see the problem there, because part of the problem is we say the third decree is the Sunday law. That is, when we take this history, and if we're looking at this as Millerite history, in Millerite history we had, I'm going to go to the whiteboard and just show you some of the problems that I'm having in trying to understand this. And and I think I've made quite a few mistakes in trying to sort this out. That is, just hang on. And these types of mistakes that I've made, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm particularly making these mistakes more than anyone else, but in trying to sort them out, I've probably propagated some of these mistakes. It's been a bit difficult for people to understand these problems. So let me think about this a second. Okay. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3. When we look at Millerite history, remember, we take this history, and this becomes this waymark, or line, I should say, that becomes midnight cry, and this is, we'll just put first day of the first month, and we'll put 10th day of the 7th month. So we got the 10th day of the 7th month, first day of the first month, 5th day of the 4th month, and the first day of the 5th month. So this is 2016. And it's not quite correct, because we'd actually have midnight cry in the middle, and we'd have them as big waymarks, and then you'd have this midnight as something a little bit before the midnight cry and as a smaller little waymark. But the idea is we have these four waymarks. And this is, what message is this?
Sawmill snows?
Okay, yeah, but this is the second angel's message, right?
Yes.
But we take this as our reform line. But doesn't our reform line actually beat all three messages?
No, I think our
Yes.
reform line should be the first two.
Okay. Yeah, and what's repeated is the first two, but coming up to the third, right? So you're going to have the first two messages and the arrival of the third, and that marks the reform line. Actually, the rest of it never gets resolved. That is, you're going to have a failure after a reform line, because if the reform lines were complete, the Reformation, the restoration from sin would have been complete. And so God has this chain of reform lines that are connected by a progressive destruction of 4. So that's progressive destruction of 4, and then a reform line. And then a falling away, and another progressive destruction of 4 and a reform line. And there are the major ones, which are the dispensational changes. And then there are minor ones that occur. But when we look at this here, because remember, Jeff had this big reform line. However he would have looked at it, I'm pretty sure it was the time, we'll put like this, the time of the end, the Sunday law, the close of probation. I'm not sure that he did, I don't think he did this. It could have been the second coming being in there, but I don't remember if he ever had a reform line that ended with the second coming.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think this would have been his first basic reform line. And that in 1989, he saw it was the time of the end, and he saw the Sunday law coming. Now, once he gets to 9/11, though, you're going to have this. And you can see that this is just this part of this reform line, right? Because this is going to be 9/11. Midnight cry, Sunday law. So that's how Jeff is then going to. But you can see the problem here is that we've been zooming in, but we think this is the reform line. And this is going to be a close of probation. The Sunday law becomes a close of probation by comparing it to Millerite history. But in the big line, the way that Ellen White had it, can you not see that our reform line is a zooming into the Sunday law waymark on the big line? And that we're taking what happened in Millerite history that preceded the arrival of the third angel's message, where you had a first and a second, and that in our history, it's a repeat of the parable of the 10 virgins, which is the first and second angel's message. And it's going to precede the empowerment of the third angel's message, which is going to be the Sunday law. But we also have a problem too, because we have this repeat occur before the Sunday law. But Ellen White says that the midnight cry parallels the loud cry. So I'm not trying to confuse people here, but can you see the problems, at least, that we're facing, that we have to sort out? And then we have this other problem, is we have this here, which we're going to call, we'll just call it Samuel Snow's letters. So you have Samuel Snow's letters that precede midnight, and we've come to understand that this is our experience, and that when we look at this history, this 9/11 and this 9/11, which is the empowerment of the first angel, and this is the arrival of the second angel, that somehow Samuel Snow's letters is connected in our history here, in between this event, but it's still part of this event. That is, Samuel Snow's letters, they're zooming into the second angel's message, into its development, into its arrival. But it's connected with this history.
So Theodore, the 9/11, the first angel empowered and second angel arrives. That's a period of time?
No, they're two different events in Millerite history, but they're marked as one event in our history. But in our history, they serve two different purposes then. So 9/11 has two different purposes. And so when we're looking at the development of FFA, the second angel's message, we know that it comes before 9/11 here on this line, but it is, okay, how do I put that?
Mhm.
This is 9/11, and this movement is the children of 9/11, right? We could say we're the children of 9/11. This is the movement of 9/11 at this point,
Yes,
right? And so that's
I've heard it called that
the
before.
empowerment of the first, and this is the development of the understanding of the second angel's message. And that occurs in Millerite history with Samuel Snow's letters that begin before the arrival of the second. But the arrival of the second angel's message in our history, we line up with what? So what do we line up the second angel's message with? Because it arrives here at 9/11.
Josiah Litch's. Didn't we line it up with Josiah Litch?
Okay, well, we line it up with Josiah Litch here, and we line it up with April 19th here. Right? So we have the empowerment of the first angel is 9/11, and the arrival of the second angel is also 9/11. So when we did that, when we brought these two messages together, it seemed fine when we were looking at our line. But once we spread it out like this, we can see that there is two different purposes of 9/11, and they're zooming into two different places on the line. Because remember, Jeff had the line go like this: time of the end, Sunday law, close of probation. So where did he have the Sunday law? Did he have it as the third? Or did he have it as the second? Right? You understand what I'm saying? So when he had a line like this, that had close of probation over here, Sunday law here, and the time of the end here, which you can't see. There. Was the Sunday law the second way mark or the third?
Second.
We think it's a second?
Yeah, it's the second way mark, right? So you have this problem because when you look at this line that we eventually developed, you see the Sunday law is the third way mark. That is, the Sunday law is the close of probation for Seventh-day Adventists. But originally he had a line that looked like this. So the question is, how did we get from this to this? And it had to have been a zooming into the way mark. That is, when he zoomed into the Sunday law, it produced this line. That is, the Sunday law, even though it's the arrival of the second angel here, can we not see it's the empowerment of the third angel here? I hope I'm not confusing people more. Though we are confused. I mean, and we should be able to see that we don't quite understand what it is we're looking at when we're looking at a reform line. And I think that that's true, not just for our history, but even for past reform lines. That is, God's given us a model, he's given us a template, but we haven't quite discerned how to apply it. That is, we can zoom in into a reform line and think that we're looking at a bigger part of a reform line when we're looking at a smaller part of a reform line. Now, I'm going to try something different, just as a thought experiment. Okay, what's the biggest reform line we can think of? And it's going to end here with, I'll put here, the Great White Throne Judgment. Okay, so that's after the 1,000 years, correct?
Yes.
And we're not going to label these things. We're just going to put these events on this line. And we're going to have here the second coming. So this is the 1,000 years, right? And then we're going to have here 7 last plagues. This is the close of probation. So that's over here. Where are we going to start?
We have to start before Adam and Eve, do we?
Okay, so we're going to have a period of darkness. And
So
what
before the
darkness
earth.
is this?
Before the earth was formed?
Okay, so this is satanic darkness. How's that? Because if we're going to look at the biggest reform line, wouldn't it be the reform line of the fall of Lucifer to the restoration of God's kingdom?
It makes sense, yeah.
Yes.
Makes
Yes.
sense. Big.
So we got a period of darkness. So we're going to have an arrival of a message. And what's going to be the first angel's message? When is that going to arrive?
When he's thrown out of heaven?
Well, how about let there be light?
Okay.
Would that be the first angel's message?
Yes.
And it's going to go through, and we looked at that reform line of the creation day. And when you look at that, you can see that that whole creation of man is tied up here in this arrival of this first message. It's the creation of the world. And you're going to have man. So you're going to obviously have an increase of light. Now, when we look at the sin of Adam and Eve, I mean, somebody could say we're going to start with the sin of Adam and Eve, and then have a period of darkness. But Adam and Eve are part of the increase of light. That is, they were given to deal with this darkness. But we can see within this period of Adam and Eve that there's this increase of light of God's character. And that's what Adam and Eve were created for. They're created in the image of God. And all of creation is to reveal God's character. Now, so the question is, when did the second angel arrive? And who's going to be tested under the first angel? Like, maybe that's a question. So we're going to have the first angel arrive. I guess what we can do here is we're going to put the second angel arrives here. So we're going to have to decide about, in the history of the world, right? Not in the history of Adam and Eve. We're going to have to decide what the second angel's message is. Because this is just, and maybe not the history of Adam and Eve. We'll just say, okay, what's the second angel's message? What would we put here? Let's just deal with that.
Would we put Jesus?
Okay, so I would put the cross here. Okay, does that make sense?
Somewhat.
Isn't the second angel the cross?
Yes.
Then the third angel would be his coming. Or not his coming.
Well, you know, what we could do here is we could just say this is all dealing with the second coming in some ways. This is zooming into the second coming. But I think in the history of the world, you have the first angel's message, which is all about addressing this apostasy that's happened in heaven by the creation of the world. And man, like, the question is, who fails here? So if we're going to put two groups, what two groups would we put here? I mean, and that's, it's a little bit of a tricky question.
Children of men versus children of God.
Okay. But in the context of, let's say, the cosmic great controversy, and I'm not even sure that we should put all those events here. Maybe take out something here. But is there a close of probation when the second angel arrives?
Yes.
Okay. So whose probation closed?
And
The Jews?
Protestants, wasn't it?
Okay, well, not, but I'm talking about in the history of the world.
No.
The world.
The Jews.
Okay, but that's not the history of the world. So, because this is in heaven, this is a heaven. Isn't this a heaven issue?
It would be Satan's probation closes at the cross.
Well, okay, Satan's probation, I don't know if it would close at the cross, but something happens in regard to Satan. We know that Satan is unmasked, and we know we have angels that have fallen and angels that have not fallen, right?
Right.
But what happens at the cross, according to the spirit of prophecy in heaven? What's the consequences? Are Satan's sympathies, any sympathy that he may have, is that totally come to an end at the cross? Does he expose himself for who he is at the cross?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's something to do with the issue of heaven. And, maybe what we could do is, do something different here. I don't know how to deal with the end here. But we could see that there's this big cosmic reform line, and the earth is part of that. and I don't know how we would mark this other than if this is the cross, we have some history here, and we have some history here that's addressing the great controversy. So maybe we could call this the great controversy reform line. I don't know if we've ever really looked at that whole great controversy reform line. But when we look at a reform line, we would have to say that there is a great controversy reform line.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now,
I
we
agree.
also have to have, the first angel is formalized, the first angel is empowered, the second angel is formalized, the second angel is empowered. And then we would have the third angel arrives. So maybe that's not correct to put it at the close of probation, but maybe it is. Maybe the third angel, is formalized in second coming. I don't know. This is just a thought experiment. But we should be able to see that God's dealings with men are ever the same, and that would be true of angels. Now, we could just say there was a reform line that happened in heaven at the beginning, but we can see that this is about the restoration of God's universe, and that the history of humanity is a reform line within that. And trying to understand here, this 1,000 years, what is this for Satan? I mean, we know that Satan has already closed his probation. So it's when we talk about a close of probation here or somewhere here.
When we were talking the other day about the, that was a different study at Collins,
Okay.
but about the man inside Jerusalem that was giving the warning for 7 years, a strange man, and then understanding that he also died in the destruction of Jerusalem. So maybe a full awareness of what his sins are and the impact on the world, because he has no one to influence.
Okay. So somehow, Satan has no one to influence. I don't know if I have a different view on that. I mean, we know that not one Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem, and that man did. But there is sort of in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, and even in normal language, we often say things that when we look at the details, it doesn't mean exactly what we think it means. That is, you could say not one Christian died, but there's an exception of this one person who was actually used by God. He was a prophet and he died. But we don't normally do that. So I'm not saying that person was somebody that was lost.
Okay. Yeah.
I believe that he's a prophet. I don't think that you can take the two statements and just say, well, obviously he wasn't a Christian.
Yeah. No,
He
it
didn't want to be a
became
Christian. What's that?
it became an undecided comment as we went forward, because there was not really enough to clarify either way.
Right. Yeah.
Because
So,
strange man or strange being, I think it is the phrase.
yeah.
So does that even mean he's a man?
Right. He could be an angel.
It starts out that he's a man, or for earlier up in that paragraph. So, but for the 1,000 years here, you're identifying.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
I struggle getting onto your train of thought here, Theodore.
well, my train of thought is simply that we have reform lines, and We have lots of other reform lines. We're going to have the Great White Throne Judgment. Now that's also going to be connected with the New Jerusalem, right? The New Jerusalem is going to come down from God out of heaven. And, at some point, and I would say,
would have to have a 30 angel message formalized and a 30 angel message empowered.
yeah,
Somewhere there.
yeah, somewhere there. So I don't know the answer to that. All I do know is that when we look at all these other histories, that one thing we should be able to do is we should be able to look at the history of the Great Controversy, and we should be able to see that there is something that happens that is parallel to all the other reform lines. Now, one of the things that I noticed with a reform line is that you'll have an arrival of the third angel, and then you will have a falling away, and then you will have a building, either a building being destroyed or a building being built under the fourth angel. So the point that I'm making here is that we should be able to look at these reform lines and see them in their simplicity and not be confused about the bigger line to the reform lines that occur when we zoom in. That is, they should be consistent. They should be the same. Now, when it comes to this idea of moving the waymarks, that was, an accusation that people made regarding Jeff, which is one of the first reasons why some people left the movement, is they didn't like any new light that came to the reform lines, because to them it seemed to disturb them. And especially as we got information about Millerite history, people weren't happy about that because they had this simple idea of what these reform lines were. But you can see that within these reform lines, we could talk about something like the second angel, if this is the cross, and you look at the scheme, maybe not of the Great Controversy itself, but just the scheme of the origins of sin within mankind, when Christ died on the cross, this we could see in the sanctuary symbolism, right? And we could see that there's what would be the formalization of Christ dying on the cross.
For the gospel going the disciples, Pentecost.
Okay. Yeah, so this would be the early Christian church. We could say that that's a formalization, and it's the work of Christ in the holy place. So, we could probably say that this is just that history of the first four churches, and we could maybe put 1798 here. The second angel is formalized or empowered, pardon me. And this is Millerite history. From Millerite history up until the third angel's message. So we could say that really Millerite history to the close of probation is all just the empowerment of the second angel's message. But that when we zoom into it, we see all this other history. So that's what I'm trying to get at with this thought experiment. The idea is that when we look at a reform line, maybe it's just a zooming in, a fractal of a much bigger reform line, and that we see the same characteristics in each reform line because they're part of a bigger reform line. Does that make sense?
It does. I think we're onto something here. I think we need to sort of flush this out. But would it help if we did the 1, 2, 3 step testing process?
Yeah, well, and that's kind of what we did here. So there's a message that comes. Okay, remember the studies we did on the sanctuary. Maybe what we could say here is that the first angel's message, we could include the satanic darkness, we could include it maybe with the origin of sin in mankind as well. But that when we zoom into the first angel, that is the story in Genesis chapter 1 to 3, maybe a little bit beyond, we have a reform line that we see here, but it's really just this reform line with the creation of the world. And in that reform line, we have, the origin of sin in mankind. Maybe this is the flood, right? So I'm just going to say here, this is the flood. This is the history of Israel. This is the history of the cross. Maybe this includes, a lot more than what we just think of as the time of the disciples. Maybe there's more to it. The formalization here, this is the history of the church, right? Now, but overall, in each of these, you're going to have a 1, 2, 3. However you want to define it. Right now, we're just looking at sort of the big picture. But this is also part of the prophetic chain. That is, the prophetic chain begins with a reform line. Each one of these major reform lines, whatever we're going to mark those as, each one of those major reform lines is going to have its own period of darkness, its own time of the end, its own, laying of the foundations, of course, its own work of the enemies, its own arrival of the second angel. It's going to have its own cross, so to speak. And it's going to have its own, formalization and empowerment of that second angel's message. And then finally, a test, which would be marked by a close of probation. And that's going to happen in each one of these major waymarks that we would have on this big reform line in the Great Controversy. And that means each one of these major waymarks is going to have, this falling away in the first generation and a progressive destruction of 4 from the previous waymark on the big line.
But wouldn't your great
You're saying
controversy
every
reform
4
line
generations.
have a,
Okay, Tom, I didn't.
yeah,
Go on.
wouldn't your great controversy reform line have a 1, 2, 3 step process then and a 4? So rather, could we start from there and then work back to the 3 angels?
This is the 4th. I didn't explain that. Because the 4th always has to do with a building. Okay? And in this case, it's the New Jerusalem. And I'm not saying that this is the way to mark it out. I'm just using this as an example. However, we're going to understand this. But when we zoom into a reform line, you're going to have a 3-step testing prophetic message. And then a 3rd is going to be followed by a 4th. And that 4th is going to deal with a building of some sort, either destruction of a building or a building of a building. And the way that I look at that is I compare the 3 decrees and the 3 angels' messages. In the 3 decrees, you're going to have the building of Jerusalem that happens under the 4th, Nehemiah's decree. And in Adventism, you're going to have the rebuilding of Jericho that happens in 1863. And those are parallel. And in each of those buildings, there's a good and a bad aspect to it. There's some organization that occurs, but it's always under the 4th.
But there's also a building that goes on at the before the close of probation that is revealed in the second coming. A building of 2 different groups of people.
Yeah, so you're talking about the building of a temple. So that's so you can see that what ends up happening is we look at a reform line. Let's say the reform line of the Millerites, the 3 angels' message reform line. Or you look at the reform line of the 3 decrees. But when we start to zoom in to these things, we can get confused. That is, we can think we're looking at something that's part of the bigger line in and of itself, when it's actually just a part of that particular waymark. And so, in the 3 decrees, for instance, because this is your primary waymark to me, you got the first, second, and the third. Now, you're going to have the laying of the foundation of the temple is going to happen in this history. You're going to have the work of the enemies. But the temple is going to be completed. I know you can't read that. But the temple is going to be completed here under the second angel's message. But when you start to zoom into this history, there is a little bit more detail because there's a reform line of Haggai and Zechariah. Now then we also, of course, have the story of Esther in here. And Esther is about, need an H in there. Esther is about the Sunday law, right?
Correct.
But if we took Jeff's line where he goes like this, 9/11, I'll do it this way. I'll do time of the end, 9/11, Sunday law. You see the problem. And then eventually he just makes the reform line all of this. We just look at the reform line from here, which is really just the second angel's message. And the question is, what is this history here? Why is this here? But we're saying the Sunday law is here. This has never been resolved. Jeff never addressed this problem that he started to create as he zoomed in to different reform lines and then confounded the zoom in of a reform line with the bigger reform line. And you can see the problem that we would have in our history. That is, we don't know what reform line we're on. When we talk about midnight, has midnight come? Well, midnight's already come and passed on some reform lines in our history, but not on others. And then we have to decide in the big line, is there even a midnight that is in our history? Or is that just a midnight from zooming into our history? Because midnight is the parable of the 10 virgins, which occurs in Millerite history. But Millerite history really is a zooming in to a waymark on a bigger line. So we have to decide what that means, because in Millerite history, you have 1844 as the close of probation. It's a shut door, but it's not the close of probation. So even when we talk about Ellen White's close of probation that she has before the 7 last plagues, is that a close of probation just from the Millerite line where it finally ends? Or is it a close of probation on some bigger line, like the history of sin?
I'd say the history of sin.
Yeah, so because that's the final close of probation. That's where, and we can see here, the sympathies that Satan may have had come forever to an end when Christ is crucified, because Satan exposes himself. He had been working in darkness prior to that. There still was some question. But we know that this history here completes that work that Christ did at the cross so that sin can never rise up a second time. Satan has exposed himself, but now Christ needs to be revealed in his people in order to bring an end to sin forever. He needs that final generation to go through this history before he can come to claim his people as his own. And maybe we don't even fully understand this whole reform line of the Great Controversy. That's what we have to set out. That's the task that I think is before us right now. And you can see some of the benefits of this, because we have a message to give to Seventh-day Adventists. And that message is the message that we see in the Great Controversy. That is, our message is the message of that was given to us through the spirit of prophecy. And the great controversy is the message, right? It's the message to the world to understand the great controversy. Would we agree with that?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And
Yes.
Adventists are confused about this. They're confused about sin. They're confused about Christ's nature, what was done at the cross. They're confused about the sanctuary. And somehow God has to give us a message.
If they can see the lines clearly, then they'll understand.
Right. And you can see he's given us line upon line to communicate a message.
I think we're on to something
Amen.
here, because I think if we understand the big great controversy line, everything cascades after that. And it would be easier to start from the great controversy line and work down to explain it than trying to go the opposite way, I
Well,
think.
Okay, I agree with that to some degree, but I'll tell you what I think about that after Chris says something.
I was just going to agree that I think there's some real value in seeing the big picture.
Right.
But then there is also going to be some real value in being able to zoom in on different sections to help understand how that took place.
Okay. Right. Now here's another thought, and it's just a thought. So when we look at each of these, I got to zoom it this way. So when we look at each of these reform lines, we have the reform line of Noah, and we're zooming in, and we're going to see a reform line. Could we agree that zoom in, even though it parallels the entire reform line, is speaking more to that particular waymark on the big line?
Yes.
Okay.
So
That is, when we zoom in, for instance, to the waymark that we would call the cross, the actual cross, it's going to be speaking more, that reform line is going to be speaking more about the cross, which is the waymark itself, so that there is a weight or a balance. I'm trying to think of a way to sort of express it, that when we look at the reform line of Noah, for instance, if we understand that the reform line of Noah is the empowerment of the first angel's message on the big reform line, and that is, we had sin being introduced under the arrival of the first angel's message in the great controversy reform line. I think that that's a solid assumption, and that Noah is either the formalization or the empowerment of that. I mean, it has to be one of them. But the thing is, it's going to speak more to that issue than it's going to speak to the close of probation at the end of the world, or of the cross, even though it's going to have those characteristics within it.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll have the characteristics, but it's only going to speak about that one particular reform line.
Right.
And we don't need to move it to another one. And that stops us confusing where we are.
Yeah. Well, we can lay these reform lines over top of each other, because that's what we're doing here on this chart. So we lay a reform line over top of another reform line, and it gives us more details. But we would have to say, for instance, when you have a medical transparency, like a transparency dealing with the anatomy, right, in a medical book, I mean, you're going to have the skeleton, and then you're going to have, the nervous system. You're going to have the organs. You might have the lymphatic system. You might have these different systems, and you lay these transparencies over top, and eventually, you can see all of the systems that exist, and they tell you about the whole body. And we can see that each one, though, is different. That each transparency is not the same It's not addressing the same issue. That is, each reform line is particular to the big reform line, the time in which it is within that big reform line of the Great Controversy. It's going to speak more to that, but it doesn't mean that it's mute when it comes to looking at other reform lines. It definitely is helpful to understand different reform lines. As well, we know that we can zoom into any of these particular reform lines and we can find other reform lines. And the question is, how do we address that? You know, Samuel Snow's letters is a zooming in to the second angel's message. Because it deals with the arrival of that second angel's message, it deals with the formalization of that message, and then the empowerment of that message. But we also have the second angel's message that has its own formalization, which is midnight, and its own empowerment, the midnight cry. And so the question is, why is that? Why did we see that in Snow's letters? What was God trying to teach us? Now, this is a big task that we have before us, because we have to go back to these old reform lines and try to understand how God was revealing them to us. And we have to sort out, you know, what was missed, because we know they don't have midnight in the midnight cry. And the question is, should they have midnight in the midnight cry? I mean, that's actually quite a big question. Because is midnight in the midnight cry, you know, how do we understand those things within a reform line when we never had them before? Right? They created real problems when we tried to go back, when I tried to go back, and others that I've tried to go, you know, seen what they've tried to do. I mean, how do you place, let's say, in the story, and I don't think this one even has it. Yeah, this doesn't even have the story of Joseph in here. But in the story of Joseph, you know, we have a reform line. And the question is, where did we put midnight in the midnight cry? Because we never had them there before. And when our midnight, and maybe we could even argue that somehow that the formalization and the empowerment are zooming in to the second to a message itself, that is, you know, that it's these reform lines are part of that. But I don't know, right? I don't have the answer to these things, but we can see there is this, you know, just looking at this great reformatory movement line, right? So if we're going to take this line that we had up there and we're going to place this as the great controversy reform line again. So we're just going to look at this, and we just have a few minutes. But we can see that there must be this period of darkness, this time of the end that comes. Now, here they have the time of the end over here and the darkness over here, but the darkness actually exists before the time of the end. And we said the time of the end is the time of the beginning, when God creates the earth. So that's how he's going to address the darkness. And we looked at the reform line that existed in the creation of the world itself. But we can see, but that time of the end is also the time of the end that marks the entire great controversy issue. But it doesn't mean that you can't look at that time of the end and see a reform line. You can, right? Now, when I look at this first one where it talks about reform and it says worldwide, what do we think of when we look at that worldwide sin and reform? What reform line would we think of when we look at that? Wouldn't it be the reform line we see below there, the reform line of Noah? Isn't it a worldwide flood?
Yes.
Isn't it addressing sin? And so can't we see that that's probably more the empowerment of the first angel's message, or the arrival of the first angel's message happens at the time of the end, but ultimately it's empowered at the flood. Jeff, you got some music playing there.
Oh, I'm
not-
sorry,
It's not mine.
Oh, that's Ron. Oh, that's Ron. Okay.
my clock.
Oh, your clock does that, eh? Okay, so when we look at this reform line, then can we see that that must be the case, that Noah's reform line must be the empowerment
And
of,
Noah sounded all this off, off.
yeah, but it's the empowerment of the arrival of the first angel's message that begins with the time of the end, the creation of the world, and that increase of light, and that's ultimately going to end with the empowerment of the first angel. And that empowerment of the first angel, then, when we look at Noah below it, that whole reform line of Noah is just placed in that first angel's message, the empowerment of the first angel. But we'd also have to say that there is a reform line of the creation of the world and a reform line dealing with the fall of Adam and Eve. That each in and of itself is a reform line. Are we
Yes, I
agreed
think
that
you're
this?
right.
Yeah, we're agreed that this makes a great deal of sense. And it's
It
not
does,
something,
it actually does make sense.
yeah, and it's not different than what we had been doing, except that we didn't apply it to a bigger line. We just looked, when we talked about the big line, we could talk about the line from 1798 to the second coming, because that's sort of the big line of the Millerites, so to speak. But the
What
big
I
line
keep
of the
seeing here
Millerites,
is,
what's that?
I said, what I keep seeing here is actually repeat and enlarge,
Yes,
because we're zooming in as we enlarge,
right.
and it fits in between the first and the second of the, and what we'll, I don't know, because it's a little confusing when you say the big line. This is the great reform. I mean, this is the great controversy reform.
Yeah, that's
line.
what we're looking at here now. We're thinking of it in that context. Yeah, so the great controversy is this. It's in a sense a template, but it's also just the big reform line. It's the reform line, and as God moves from the darkness that came in heaven, he has had this reform line, this restoration. But each of these reform lines, each of these waymarks, have reform lines within them. That is, God is progressively revealing his truth, testing different groups along the way, and that we can understand them all by laying them over top of each other. And then we can start to understand what that means for us at the end of the world. Now, we've already seen this, and God has sorted out quite a bit for us. In the paper after July 18th, there's a lot there that was understood that we didn't understand before. But we need to be able to present a message to Seventh-day Adventists, and God's given us the reform lines as the means of understanding truths for ourselves, but also of giving a message. And that means we have a work to do. That Adventists need to understand these reform lines. They need to understand Millerite history primarily first, and they need to understand our history. But these other reform lines are just as necessary to give them the big picture and to tie the story of the Great Controversy. And it could be, if we look at, Ellen White's writing of the Great Controversy, that, the way that she lays it out, we might be able to just take, let's say, the book, The Story of Redemption, and maybe we might be able to see what that reform line is simply by going through a book like that, which Heidi and I are going to be reading. But
I think it's kind of interesting that the great controversy starts at the destruction of Jerusalem.
yeah, and it shows that it's a type of the end of the world. So
Right.
it's taking, and that's the reform line of Christ, right? So what the book, The Great Controversy, starts there. But the Great Controversy vision doesn't start there. It starts with
No.
Lucifer in heaven. But in the book, The Great Controversy, which is going to address the reform line from the time of Christ to the second coming, we can see that that's a much larger reform line.
I mean, can we place the Great Controversy series as 1, 2, 3, 4 on a line?
Maybe. I mean, I would say, yeah, I don't know if it's as simple as that. But definitely, when you look at the Great Controversy, it starts, with patriarchs and prophets. So it's going to deal with that whole history prior to the establishment of ancient Israel itself as a nation. So it's going to begin. You could probably divide the first book into two parts. That is, the early patriarchs, and then that history leading up to, after the Exodus, leading up to the time when the kings are. So that history of pre-Israel and post-Israel would be two different areas, maybe. And then of course, you have the period of the kings, the prophets and kings. But, you also have the book like Acts of the Apostles. Well, is that like a reform line? I don't know. And of course, Desire of Ages being the reform line of Christ, his history. And then the Great Controversy dealing with really more than one reform line. So I don't know. I mean, that's the thing, is I wish I had all the answers. That would be really easy, right? And I had a nice chart with everything drawn up with all the details, and all correct details.
How would we learn anything then?
Yeah.
My experience with learning is you make mistakes until you get it right.
Okay.
That's just been my experience. I've taken information and to try to do something, and my misunderstanding of certain bits of information always resulted in not the right thing. And then so I'm making a mistake. And then, but once I've clarified that mistake, I've learned something, and it sticks with me at that point. It's just my learning process.
Yeah. Now, the other thing about this, I mean, I know I'm going a bit over time, but the other thing about this is that we have gone through an experience which has enlightened us.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. So we've gone through this experience of these dates that we've set, and we've passed December 25th. And people still have questions about, well, nothing happened on December 25th, as maybe something should have.
Not true. Not true. There was some things that came up during those meetings that were like the first things, that we've ever heard or experienced.
Right.
Thoughts.
And one of the things that I've known about this time setting line, if you want to call it that, is that it has been about an increase of light. I've actually had particular dates that I put on a line, like the 10th day of the 10th month, October 10th. And on that day, I came to understand how the Mayan calendar applied to July 18th in a way that I'd never seen before. And one of the dates it gave me was the next date, October 11th. And that was very profound to see this increase of light happening. God gives us light to our feet as we walk along a path. He doesn't give it before, right? He gives it to us when we need it. And the 777 years from 457 to 321 AD to Constantine's Sunday Law was an extremely profound message from God to us, because we had marked December 25th as the Sunday Law. And here we could see that 777 years end at the Sunday Law, Constantine's Sunday Law. And
So Stephen came up with that
yeah,
just recently, right?
on Christmas Day.
On Christmas Day. Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
So it wasn't before then, right?
Okay.
So the fact that he gave it to us then, when we should have noticed it, right? That is, I mean, I was doing all kinds of things from 457 BC, but for some reason, and I think I did actually see 321 once when I counted 777 years, but it didn't click in my mind at the time, and I just ignored it. I actually remember just thinking 321. That's what I was thinking of it more as a symbolic number, 321, counting down. And I thought, oh, that's March 21st as well. But yeah, it never clicked into me that was Constantine's Sunday law for some reason, because that was quite a while ago, back like 2000.
You think it'd be something you'd run into?
2015.
You think it'd be something you'd run into, easily?
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. And I
Never
said,
easily, and yet it on Christmas Day it came up.
yeah. So that's what I'm saying, is that God is giving us this light, and I feel a little overwhelmed by the task. That as I understand my limitations as a human being, and I know I can't definitely do this, on my own. That this is going to have to be a group effort, and of course we need the Holy Spirit, but we need the different people to accomplish this task. And how it's going to unfold, how long it's going to take, God isn't giving us any of that information. He's just asking us to take up the task now. And I learned when I was a kid that if I wanted to accomplish a task like cleaning my bedroom, I would just have to start and not look at how big the job was.
And stay focused.
Yeah, and just do what I could. And then before I knew it, the job was done. And this is something my mom taught me. She'd just say, well, don't worry about cleaning up your whole room. Just start with under your bed with all the orange peels and banana peels under there. That type of thing.
Step by step, right?
Yeah. So I learned that, as a kid, to approach a task that way. And I've approached lots of bigger tasks as an adult that way, things that were overwhelming. And I just said, okay, I just need to start. I mean, that's how I ended up with a guitar store. If I had looked at what had to happen, I couldn't have accomplished it. And even in my Christian walk, when I first came to God, and surrendered my heart to Him, I just knew that it was the beginning of a path. I didn't really look to the end and try to figure out, how I'm going to get there. I just knew that I could entrust my life in God's hands and that we would get there step by step. And so that's what we have to do here with this issue. So let's
surrender daily.
Yeah. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you once again for this study. And for the job that you've given us to do. We know, Lord, that this is a sacred work, something that you have given us, and it's something that you will help us complete. Help us to be faithful in the little things, and help us in these studies each day as we go through, and help us to figure out how to get through these studies, how to approach them. We pray for each person. We pray that you can enlighten each of our minds, and that as you've been leading us, that you will continue to lead us. May your angels watch over each one. May you help us in our day-to-day struggles, and may you bring us together again, if it is according to thy will, to study your word. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.